Hello. So I would like to start a first panel discussion, which will be moderated by Mr. Wacht, and he will introduce the panelists, etc. So the focus is EU-American relationship.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the first panel of this morning. Will EU relations be great again? I'm happy to see so many of you attending, and I promise you that we will open this floor very early so that you have the opportunity to get involved and ask your questions. We are now 1 week after the United Nations General Assembly, where President Donald Trump has put into question the agreement that the EU has brokered together with the US over the Iran nuclear facility development, which is just the last event in a series of events where achievements of the transatlantic alliance have been put into question. But to say one thing very clearly, our debate here will not that much be of another Donald Trump discussion, but more of a general one on security on the European continent. How can security on the European continent best be provided, and through which organization? Will this rather be through NATO? Will it rather be through more European autonomy? What can be a solution? And I'm very happy that we have 4 distinguished speakers with very specific backgrounds who will contribute 4 very different perspectives. I would like to introduce you Vladislav Davidson, an American who's currently based in a European country struck by war, in Ukraine. He's living in Odessa. He's a journalist and literature criticist and the chief editor of the Odessa Review. Thank you. If we're talking about transatlantic relationships, we're also always talking a bit about trans-Bosporus relationships. I'm happy to welcome Magdalena Kirchner. She's a conflict researcher, a political scientist. She has worked for various institutions in America, in Germany, and currently she's based in Istanbul. And I'm very much looking forward to hear a bit more about Turkey's current view on transatlantic relationships. Welcome, Magdalena. I would like to welcome Peter Chase, who has dedicated most of his professional life to transatlantic relationships. I hope I'm not exaggerating if I say so. He's been an American diplomat for more than 30 years, and he's currently senior resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund in Brussels. Welcome, Peter. And last but not least, someone who has been a leading figure in a European Union institution, Janusz Onyszkiewicz. He was a spokesperson for Solidarność in the 1980s. He was even imprisoned for his activity there. Later on, after the end of Cold War, he was twice Polish defense minister and vice president of the European Parliament. Welcome. As I see, we have Americans, half Americans, and people who have worked for transatlantic organizations. So I'm tempted to believe that I have some firm transatlanticists sitting here on the panel. So I would like to start and challenge this assumption a bit. I would like to ask you, Peter, first of all, if we look at how the world currently develops, there's reason to assume that even independently from Donald Trump, the United States will probably lose power relatively on a global scale. And as the US still hold up a global level of ambition, my question is, can we assume that the United States of America in 20 years' time will still be able to hold up that global ambition, or will they have to pick priorities? And can we as Europeans then still trust the USA as a partner when it comes to our security?
Okay, well, first, thank you very much for inviting me to the Institute, for inviting me to join in your discussions. And thank you, Sebastian, for your question. I'm going to answer first the big question of the panel, which is, will US and European relations be great again? And the short answer is yes, but perhaps not in the next 4 years. So whether or not you want to talk just about Trump, Mr. Trump is certainly an aspect of the relationship that we have now, but I think it will go. I am a fervent believer that the United States and Europe, the United States and the European Union, when they are working together, can achieve great things. I believe that strongly. Unfortunately, I believe that we won't be as active or as positive or as constructive as we could and should be over the next 4 years. But I think that we need to continue to be working maybe at lower levels on a host of different areas. I'm going to just mention very briefly, because we do want this to be interactive, 3 axes, 3 agendas, items. One is values, one is security, one is economics. You know, I hate the cliche about the US and Europe sharing common values, because it is a cliche. For me, it means something. It means that we believe in the dignity of the individual, and we believe in the political and the economic systems that support and promote that, democracy and a market-based economy, and the rule of law that underlies them both. That's what the United States and Europe are about. And we are our greatest when we are promoting those values on a worldwide basis. Unfortunately, our current president in the United States is de-emphasizing the values-based approach to international relations. That's his choice. Unfortunately, it's exhibiting itself in significant reductions of things, for instance, on the foreign aid budget, and as well in the State Department, the institution I come from, is being basically decimated. There is no one in it. And I think that that is something that will reverberate for a while. But I think that keeping in our minds and keeping at the forefront of what we do and what we do together as being these values based on the respect for the dignity of the individual will be critical, and that I actually anticipate that Europe and that others will be pressing the president, as many commentators in the United States are, to say that this is not idealism. This is actually something that promotes our interests as well. Because you started by asking about the general change in the relative size of the United States economy, of the European economy, relative to the rest of the world. People tend to talk about that as our decline. I prefer to talk about it as the growth of others. The systems, the international systems we've created, have allowed and encouraged the totality of humanity to have a much better life. And that's a good thing. And if we maintain our values and we promote our values and we build alliances based on our values, then there's a relative decline, is a general betterment. Which gets to the question of security. Somehow, in this administration, the emphasis of European defense spending has become kind of a litmus test. There is a belief, I'm not certain how a multi-billionaire in the strongest country in the world can be a victim, but there's this sense that the rest of the world has been taking advantage of the United States. I personally believe that's wrong. But when it comes to NATO and other things, the fact of the matter is, the nature of the security threat we face is changing. It's not just tanks, although in some countries, tanks are still very important, and I'm looking forward to your comments, Ladislas. But it's more the issues of cybersecurity and the issues of terrorism and the issues of domestic security that governments provide. And there, I think that the administration can and should and probably will become more focused on the resources spent to addressing those issues rather than just the defense issues. In that sense, NATO and NATO's role is still important, but it is relatively less important. And I think that that's okay. It's still, but again, a relative decline does not mean an absolute decline in terms of the importance of its role. Finally, on the economic front, my background is in economics and trade policy, something that if we want to get to in the discussion, I'm happy to. The United States and Europe started a negotiation toward transatlantic trade and investment partnership precisely because we believed that bringing our countries and our economies closer together would be a good thing. Capital G, capital T, a good thing. The debates about it in the body politic in Europe were never reflected in the United States. There was no one in the United States questioning whether or not TTIP as an agreement would be useful. And it would have been the first congressionally ratified agreement between the United States and Europe. It was a good thing. I'm sorry that it has stalled. It's stalled here in Europe. It is possible the Trump administration may say, this is not a bad agreement. After all, we're both fair traders, so we can have free trade. But I think that if the politics surrounding TTIP under Mr. Obama were difficult in Europe, the politics surrounding TTIP under Mr. Trump will be impossible. So I'm afraid that that's going to be put on ice for the next 4 years, which means it's incumbent on us to find other ways to strengthen our transatlantic relationship. And there are many ways we can do that, and we can talk about those later as well.
Thank you, Peter, for your introductory statement. A very clear assessment of the transatlantic relationship as you see it. Now I would like to go across the pond to Europe, and I would like to give the floor to you, Mr. Onyszkiewicz, and ask you, as a former Vice President of the European Parliament, what is your vision of European security in, let's say, 20 years' time?
Well, first I would like to refer to this issue which has been already mentioned, that US and European Union are getting weaker. Well, it is true that relatively they are getting weaker, the others are getting stronger, but that really makes us even more or should make us even more concerned about our mutual relations, transatlantic relations. Because after all, neither United States nor European Union will not abandon their global interest, the global role. And that's why, in a situation when relatively we are weaker, the only thing we can address these issues is doing things together. That's why I think that transatlantic relationship and bond between US and European Union will eventually be, we will get better, perhaps after some time when we will have to deal with US under Trump presidency, carrying foreign policy on the basis of some transactional unilateralism. That's the trouble which obviously we will have to face. As far as security is concerned, we obviously should be quite clear that although we can assist the United States in some situations, basically this is not totally symmetrical problem. It is not symmetrical problem because of the problems we have in Europe. We in Europe rely more on US supporting our security policy than the US on us. So what really to do to make situation more equal and to somehow eliminate these concerns which are raised in the United States? First, I think that we should somehow be aware of the fact that there are three regions where the problems arise. First is Europe, especially in the East, Middle East, and Southeastern Asia. And from European perspective, this is more or less the order of importance. First, at least for us in Poland, is problems east of our border. Then there is Middle East, and Southeast Asia is somewhere on the third place. In the United States, the order is totally reversed. The Southeast Asia is probably the problem number one, and Europe is not as important. So first of all, we must realize that there is a certain difference, and we must somehow try to accommodate to this situation. What we can do, really, to make this transatlantic relationship somehow still strong and to accommodate the concerns of the United States. First is the problem of the military spending. Obviously, nobody in the United States expects that this military spending will raise in the European Union and in the European countries up to 2%. Especially in case of Germany, it will be very, very difficult, because that would mean that if Germany's defense budget will grow to 2%, it would require about 30 billion euros every year more, well, which even German economy probably will be hard to sustain. But nevertheless, the tendency is important. And I think that the tendency, although it's not that clear, it could be noticed, because in the last year, the total growth in defense spending in NATO European countries is about 4%, which is something, which is not enough, but it is something. Germany, according to the declaration of German Minister of Defense, is going to spend 130 billion euros for modernization of German army, which is quite something. So first 2% and somehow tendency to grow and to make this our commitment higher. Then what we really need is greater commitment of European Union and European NATO countries in Middle East. Obviously, there is not a question of having boots on the ground, but greater involvement in these activities which are there, like, for example, training of soldiers and military personnel in this area. What else we should do is to change the NATO command structure, to accommodate NATO to the new situation. After all, it is rather strange to me that the command of land forces of NATO in Europe is in Turkey. Well, this certainly is not the place where this command should be. What else? Well, there is clearly a question also of recalibrating our defense spending more towards territorial defense, because so far in many countries, and especially in Germany, German Bundeswehr was more and more oriented towards expeditionary missions. After all, the result is rather paradoxical, because in NATO now we have such a situation than in Germany, Great Britain, France, Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, there are less tanks than in Kaliningrad region alone. This is the situation we have now. We have more or less the same number of tanks that all these countries put together. So that obviously has to be changed. And what else should be done? Well, the trouble is that we will have to discuss jointly the new NATO nuclear posture. This is in view of the Russian military doctrine, which embraced the concept of using tactical nuclear weapons for so-called de-escalation. That means to freeze the situation, to secure the gains, territorial gains, which could be obtained by Russian forces at the first stage of the hostilities, and then, to freeze it and or begin to talks, following the old Russian principle that what is ours, and what is yours is negotiable. So these are the things which we should do. What US should do, also to improve this bond, is first that you should actually place European deterrence initiative into a permanent US budget. That means to allocate permanently a certain amount of money for European presence of US forces. Then missile defense, which obviously should be carried out. And finally, but not at least, is the clear political declaration which would eliminate all the doubts about American commitments to the European security. Clearly, these doubts were to some extent eliminated, but not fully. And what really worries me is that in a situation when the line of American policy is not that clear, because there is not the same sort of message from President Trump and his associates, that creates the situation in which the US intentions could be miscalculated, and that would be very dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Oniszkiewicz. There's already lots of points we will probably be able to discuss. I've seen some heads that have been nodded. I would now like to turn our attention to a country where, as Peter said, tanks are still needed, to Ukraine, and in the larger context of the question who can best provide security, how is the situation being perceived in Ukraine, and how do Ukrainians look at NATO, and how do they look at the European Union?
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you for having me. Great honor to sit next to Vice President of the European Parliament and a former defense minister and a great hero of the Cold War. I want to just back up a comment that you made about the Kaliningrad tanks. There are as many tanks in the DNR. In fact, I think the DNR is now the third or fourth of the so-called Democratic People's Republic of Donetsk. The DNR and the LNR have been folded into essentially one structure by their Russian intelligence heads that run the enclaves, the so-called separatist zones. The DNR army now, I think, is the third or fourth largest tank army in Europe. The DNR army, if there were no Ukrainian troops between them and the Slovaks and the Romanians and the Bulgarians, I would put all my money on the DNR winning a land war against the Romanian or the Moldovan or the Bulgarian army. All my money. So that's one thing. The Ukrainians, I'm going to say some, I hope not obvious things. Actually, I do hope they're obvious, but I'm not so sure because they're maybe not said often enough in Eastern Europe or Central Europe. The Ukrainian nation has been created. The Ukrainian political nation has been created over the last 3 years. A political nation that never existed before. A political nation that exists now in spirit and language and memory politics and has an army and has self-consciousness and will soon have a literature and a history. Until 2013, for the most part, Ukrainians didn't really have to think about whether they were Russians, whether they were post-Soviet people, what it is that the difference between the Ukrainian nation and the Russian nation is, what it means to be a European. I mean, they thought about these things a little bit, but the 90s were very difficult and people had to survive, and the politics in the country went back and forth between the West and the East, but really it went back and forth between oligarchic clans or political clans that represented particular regions as opposed to were East or West. As of 2013, 2014, after the Euromaidan revolution, a Ukrainian political nation has now come into existence. This is a fact. This is a fact that's irrevocable. There is no going back. What we had before 2013 is gone. That is history. There's no going back to the status quo as it was. There may be possibility in 2019 or another election cycle after that to halt political gains or democratic gains or to halt the process of democratization, Europeanization, Ukrainization. But for the most part, the processes of decommunization, decollectivization, and desovietization, and also de-Russification are taking place, and there's really very little to be done about it. That process is on its way, and that it's going to continue going that way. As Sebastian and I were talking last night during dinner, he told me to say this here. For most part, Ukrainians don't really know what Europe is. This is a aspirational idea. 70% of Ukrainian people have never been out of their home region. The infrastructure is extraordinarily bad. It takes me about 17 hours to do a trip on the train that would, on a French train or a German train, take me 4 hours. You know, I teach a lot and give a lot of lectures in the regions. Recently, I had to go from Chernowitz to Lviv, and Lviv to Kiev, and Kiev to Odessa, and Odessa to Kharkiv, and this is just a catastrophe. So because the infrastructure is so bad, because it took me 15 hours to get from Chernowitz to Odessa, and another 14 hours to get to Kharkiv, and then 7 hours to get to Kiev. For the most part, people don't travel very far, and they don't really know what other parts of the country look like. So most Ukrainians have never even been to Europe. Now we have a visa-free regime. You will see a lot more Ukrainian tourists here. That's a good thing. People will now know what it is to go to Berlin or London or Paris. There are about 1 million Ukrainians living in Poland. I don't know if it's 1,800,000, 1 million, yeah. There are about 1 million Ukrainians living in Poland. A lot of those people have Polish roots. A lot of people get Karta Poляka. There are a lot of people working in Poland, and as the Polish workers go to let's say London, their places are taken up by Ukrainian workers, and I think they're integrating very well. But for the most part, most Ukrainians have never been very far, and this is both a security problem and a conditioning space for how the psychological relationship to Europe develops. You know, when we talk about Europe in Ukraine, this is a great thing. This is, you know, good furniture, good toothpaste. People say, I have a European apartment, I have Euro remont, I have a Euro renovated apartment. When they say Europe, they think nice things. They think future. Europe is a future-oriented, aspirational idea. Even though most people don't really know what it is to be in Europe. They have no idea what it is to live in Paris or pay taxes there, or, you know, do things in a European manner, or, you know, not do things in a post-Soviet corrupt manner. So Europe is an aspirational idea. It's a very good idea, and it's taking root. All those studies that people do on Ukrainians' relationship to NATO, to the European Union, to accession to NATO, to accession to European structures. Obviously, over the last 4 years, we've had an uptick of positive responses to all those questionnaires. The country is still divided. I don't know. I've seen many different studies, and they're all different numbers, so I'm not going to give you particular statistics because they vary very greatly based on who's doing the questioning, even more than they do in Europe. And it's also important to remember that the integration into NATO isn't going to come. You know, it's not going to come next week, even though the Poroshenko government has stipulated that they would like to be in NATO by 2020. That's as ridiculous as having a Ukrainian moon colony by 2025. It's not going to happen. Clearly, even if there was the political will, even if there were no impediments from the northern neighbor to accession to NATO, even if the money was there and the will was there and the capacity was there, it would take, I think, 14 years, 15 years just to meet the technical requirements, the production requirements for weapons, for command and control operations with Ukraine's neighbors. It's not going to happen. So Ukraine is very pro-West now. Part of that is the fact that the war has changed mentalities. It has backfired on Mr. Putin and the Kremlin. Absolutely backfired. They never expected for Ukrainian nation to form and Ukrainian patriotism to form. But also removing 5 or 6 million pro-Russian voters from the Ukrainian polity. I think 3 or 4 million Crimeans no longer in Ukraine for all intents and purposes. Though, you know, which is not to say that I accept the annexation of Crimea, but for all intents and purposes, those people are now Russian voters, right? So they're no longer voting in Ukrainian elections. The Donbass, there are not going to be elections there anytime soon under Ukrainian law. There are 500,000 to 800,000 refugees on the Russian side have left the Donbass into Russia, and there's 2 million IDPs. So it's 4 or 5 million Russian or pro-Russian or potentially pro-Russian voters within the country who are no longer living in a concentrated manner in pro-Russian regions of the country. That's 10% of electorate. That has completely restructured the political map in Ukraine, and that's extraordinarily important. So I think I'll let Sebastian.
Thank you, Vladislav, for this introduction. One key aspect we will take away from your introductory statement is that Ukrainians are rather looking for NATO than for EU when it comes to their security, which is probably not a surprise, but we will build on that later in this discussion. Now, to complete our initial round, last but not least, we will cross the Black Sea and go to Turkey. Magdalena, what is your view on the transatlantic relationship in the future, and what is the Turkish view on it?
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, to the organizers for having me. And thank you for splitting the question so I can say something first on the state of the transatlantic relations as a German using like the European hat. Because I was lucky to have like a pre and post-Trump experience in Washington, and what I never understood, well, one part was the pre was pretty lucky. But what I never understood in this 2% debate was from the Americans' perspective, applauding like more European burden sharing and more European responsibility, how far would they go? Or is it a revival of George Bush nightmares, I would say, in Europe? The Americans decide the way, and the Europeans have to pay for the cleanup. So you mentioned the Iran deal, something like Donald Trump saying sovereignty and America first is important when it comes to policy planning and formulation, and we show the way, and nobody can comment on this, and we will not even negotiate or consult our partners with it. But when it's about implementing, then he calls for unity. So when you look at the Iran deal, the Europeans are concerned, rightly so, that there will be unilateralism, and then asking for more spending, but not necessarily a greater European say in where would the transatlantic alliance then actually go. So this leads already in the first month of Donald Trump, in my opinion, to a complete detachment where Europeans think, oh, North Korea, that's pretty far. That's like Trump and the North Korean government, so this is not a threat for us, so completely disengaging. It was already mentioned in the Middle East. There are some pitchy-patchy European national initiatives not coordinated with the Americans who have a completely different approach. So there is no coordination. Still, people applaud for a rise in defense budget, but not really giving the Europeans, and maybe the Europeans are not claiming it enough, a say on the strategic level. And say, what will be the priorities? And there I honestly see like a big conflict level. If the Europeans get their act together and set priorities, they will not necessarily match the Americans. Coming back to the question, and it's also a really great question, because from a Turkish perspective, this is a nightmare. When transatlantic relations is translated into US-EU, where is Turkey? Are we left out? What's the role that we get, and who will make sure that we will have a seat at the table? So this EU autonomy, which is appraised and supported for many reasons, I would say, from the other side of the Bosporus, not including the Turkish parts of Europe, is that it's seen as a risk. It's something that the Turks were afraid of since the end of the Cold War. If NATO would be abolished and reformulated, the European Union or its predecessors would have a much greater role than they had in the 50s and 40s when NATO was created, because then individual states would be taken in. So the fear of being left out was something that was very important for the Turks too, when they looked to their Western neighbors and pushing for at least, well, I would say until a couple of years, they had the hope that European integration and their membership would save them a seat at the table, but I think it's obvious for everyone in the room that this is not an option now. So they were pushing for Americans staying in, granting them the land command as to anchor Turkey more into NATO, and keeping NATO in the European defense architecture. And I think there are several trends in European defense policy in the last years that have proven Turkish concerns right. The EDA, European Defense Agency, Turkey didn't have a place at the table. CSDP, Turkey moved into like the shady area of being a partner that can take part in the missions, but doesn't really have a say in what will be these missions. And with the global strategy, Turkey is just one of 160 non-EU countries globally, a global partner that gets a special treatment but doesn't have any rights or privileges. So from the Turkish perspective, there is concern, and I did not even start to talk about all the domestic problems and the bilateral problems, that EU integration in the security aspect would actually lead to their disadvantage. Also, if we look at directly Turkey-EU relations, I think I'm not giving any surprise information saying they're really, really bad. Still, there is a cooperation, but it's not institutionalized. There is arms transfers. There is cooperation in crisis management missions, but there's no intention from the European side to make this like a permanent structure. Why? If it's EU, then you wouldn't take a third party permanently in. So this is a door that's probably slammed from the Turkish perspective. This is why Turkey wants a strong NATO, but of course like a pro-Turkey NATO. Coming to Turkish-US relations, there are also, well, more or less strains. There is a good personal relation between Donald Trump and Tayyip Erdogan, good as in the means that it's good for Tayyip Erdogan because Donald Trump always praises him as a leader, has no clue about the domestic conditions in the country or doesn't care to mention them and raise them. So he gets an international platform, high-level meetings, and little regard for domestic developments. There are problems where NATO is not involved. There's the Syria strategy. There are fundamental differences, and then we come to what I would call actually a bandwagoning strategy that Turkey is now pursuing towards Russia, which is of concern for the Americans, and it's also of concern, of course, for NATO, but nobody really knows how will this play out. Maybe making my last point here before we go into discussion, I would say that this bandwagoning trend, which should be of concern, of course, for both the European Union and the Americans, has two causes that we should look at in the future. On one, we could do something, the other one, we're more or less observers. Turkey is a good ally in the sense that it's important because of its geostrategic location. It provides personnel to NATO missions. It provides communication channels into what we call the southern flank, although previously the southern flank was the Black Sea, now it's Syria and Iraq. But defense spending is also below 2%. And what we have is a domestication of, or the overwhelming importance of domestic politics in Turkish foreign policy, given the authoritarian trends in the country. And where can we see that? First, since last year, we have massive military purges, of course, that have to be concerned by NATO, just military planners. The quota of pilots is terrifying. But what we also see is a trend towards a more nationalist tone in defense industry. So from the Turkish perspective, they go to the Russians because they were traditional partners, did not allow technology transfer, which is important for prestige, and gives a good picture in your local media. So there is more of an emphasis of a nationalism. That's of concern. But what's also of concern, and then coming back to the US-EU question, is since 2013, I would say, so it already started under Obama, there is no US pressure on the Europeans or the Turks for integration. Probably if you would ask Donald Trump, he wouldn't even say it matters because he has good bilateral relations. But there is no push to either make Turkey a member of the European Union, therefore integrating them in whatever security structure will come out, or to make them a permanent partner. That's very problematic because who will mediate or push for it if the Americans won't do it? Second problem is with the Brexit, and we will talk about that later in the conference, is that the Turks found an odd ally in the UK pushing for less EU institutionalization or institutionalization of EU-NATO cooperation in NATO, and finding good deals either around the European Union or weakening, like mostly German initiatives to make Europe bigger in NATO. Last answer to an unasked question, Turkey will not leave NATO. Because they don't have an alternative, and Russia is the last that would provide them with such an alternative. Second, being a member of NATO gives them the last influence instrument they have over European security by having a veto in the North Atlantic Council. This is why, if they're not thrown out, which is not possible right now, and we can have a debate if we want this, they will not leave. But they will push against any initiative as long as they can for more European autonomy in NATO.
Thank you, Magdalena, for this interesting assessment. I think it's worth adding that there's also the question of Cyprus is worth mentioning as an obstacle between Turkey and EU security cooperation, because Cyprus is a country that Turkey doesn't recognize. So that's one of the major problems for the cooperation between NATO and EU or CSDP as well. Peter, I would like to come back to you for a second question. Mr. Oniszkiewicz called for a permanent budget for an American military presence in Europe, which means a continued American hard power presence on the European continent. Would you approve that, or would you rather wish for more European autonomy? What would be your vision to that?
I think that's a false dichotomy. There's nothing wrong with, I mean, the United States has had effectively a military presence in Europe since the Second World War. I don't think anyone has questioned whether or not that presence will continue, although it has of course gotten smaller. And it's gotten smaller because the perceived need, the perceived threat has been there. But then again, Europe is also a critical staging area for American military assets that are projected outside Europe itself. So in a sense, there is a permanent allocation in the US defense budget for a military presence. And the interesting thing will be, should Europe change its own desire to have that military presence? I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. You talked about the next 20 years. I'd say in the next 20 years, that US military presence here will be seen as an integral part of European and EU defense planning, as well it should be. I think that, you know, in my work in the State Department, the debate within the US government about whether or not an increase in EU defense capabilities, hard military capabilities, was a good or a bad thing. Did it erode NATO? And it was a big question, and to some extent remains a question in the United States. But luckily, I think during the Obama administration, and to an extent in the second term of George W. Bush, we were already overcoming that. We were beginning to see that if you want an efficient partner in Europe on defense, then each individual European NATO member just being on its own is not efficient. And they can spend 2% of their GDP on defense, but it won't give you 2% of GDP value. So there has been an understanding and some acceptance in the Department of Defense and in the State Department in the United States that some coordination, some collaboration among the EU members on hard defense and security is a useful thing. And again, I would say that these two things, the US defense presence and greater capability among the European countries as the EU and as NATO and as members of NATO, works. It's more difficult in some ways in Europe, because it's difficult when there are members of the European Union who aren't members of NATO, and there is a certain role that NATO can and will play in terms of command and control, which I think is appropriate, again, for an efficient military capability. But even in the EU, they too, on their part, seem to be getting beyond putting NATO and the EU capabilities in opposition to each other. That's a maturation of this discussion. It's an improvement in the discussion. I hope it continues that way, but it's still, to me, a very fragile acceptance, not consensus, but acceptance that this sort of better EU integration can be a complement to NATO. Brexit, of course, is going to change to some extent that dynamic, and I'm not sure anyone knows exactly how it will change the dynamic.
Right. Now,
May I make the point of clarification?
oh, you are very welcome. Please.
Well, clearly, US is military present in Europe, but the problem was, until fairly recently, that as far as the land forces are concerned, US had only 2 brigades, that's about 8,000 people, in land forces. That was far not enough to really make a sizable contribution to any sort of military effort on the ground. And now the question is not to keep this amount of US troops, but to increase for at least 1 or 2 brigades. And that's why Obama administration put aside $3.4 billion for this purpose and for exercises and so on and so on. But this allocation expire. And that's why it would be important to have this allocation making permanent, in permanent budget, not just sort of hanging every time depending on sort of local debates in the United States. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Oniszkiewicz. Before I turn to you, Vladislav, again, we've heard that Ukrainians wish for NATO membership. It has been promised to them in 2008 in Bucharest at the NATO summit. And before I ask you a question, I would like to know from the other 3 panelists, would you want to have a solution where Ukraine is accepted in NATO, let's say, without the contested territories, including the Article 5 obligation? Would you be in favor of that? Maybe we start with you, Magdalena.
That's a good question.
That's a mean question. I would probably say no, just because as long as the conflict with Russia is going on now, I mean, I don't want to destroy Ukrainian hopes for NATO membership, and also I'm not the one that will decide on it. But I think we've seen from other member states that inviting these conflicts into NATO with Article 5 is not something that will strengthen cohesion of the alliance. And it could also lead to fatigue among other NATO members that we see when we look at polls in Germany to take Article 5 by the word. And I'll say, oh, this is something that we just give out and make it, provide it with a meaning. So I would say it's not necessarily a good idea. NATO has an interest to solve that conflict. But I think membership will not lead to a solution of that conflict.
Okay, thank you, Magdalena. I'm sorry for the mean question.
It's okay, as long as others have to answer it too.
All have to answer it. May I ask you what is your opinion?
Well, the trouble is that in the present situation, if Ukraine, even brushing aside all other problems, would be admitted, then in a present situation, that really would undermine Article 5. because that would mean that NATO should actually be involved in helping Ukrainians to regain the total control over both Donetsk, Lugansk, and also Crimea. Well, that could really create a very, very strange situation. And this is exactly the same situation with Georgia. Let's not forget it. So I think that what Ukraine needs is clearly a perspective of membership in NATO and in the European Union, but Ukraine really do not need the soldiers. Ukraine needs weapons.
Okay, thank you. Peter, you had most time to think about your response.
You know, luckily for me, you didn't put a time frame on this. And because I do think that there is an issue about how you post-apply Article 5 to a conflict that exists today, when all of the NATO members and others chose not to intervene and not to be engaged, and actually weren't even really invited in by the Ukrainians. On the other hand, you know, I think it's important to think back about what does NATO do? Why is it there? Is Ukrainian membership of NATO something that should be aspired to? What we need is we need to have a situation where the military instability that Russia has created isn't there. That's what we need. So that NATO's mission, in a sense, as a defense against an aggressive Russia, is not a mission that Ukraine needs to be brought into NATO for. You know, there are ways, it seems to me that there are ways, and important ways, that the United States and Europe, including Ukraine and many other countries, can and should be working together diplomatically as well as economically to try to shift the change so that the military aspect of defense against an offensive military incursion isn't there. Right now, I think that it would be interesting to see what the reaction would be should Russia step up its military activities, rather than, I think you were talking a little bit more about consolidation, rather than pushing forward. If they would try to step up military activities, and what would happen then? Frankly, I'd prefer that we not have to see that.
Okay, Vladislav, I know from our dinner conversation yesterday you are in favor of NATO membership. Now you've heard there's 3 no's out of 3 speakers. Now you have the chance to give a pitch for Ukrainian membership.
Oh my. Well, first of all, I live there, so I would be, wouldn't I? But I would, you know, in some ways I would agree with all of you. You know, it's too late for deterrence. It's not going to solve the problems. You have to solve the problems before you get it. So the order would be resolved. Certainly, the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian nation should make their own decisions about political alliances, right? It's absolutely their decision on which political alliance they want to be in, which defense alliances they want to take part in. There are all these academic conversations about going back to Ukrainian, Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth-style intermarium. I think those conversations, you know, where you would have overlapping defense structures with NATO and Lithuanians and Poles and Ukrainians would have another kind of structure which heralds back to arrangements that existed in the 17th century. I think those conversations are interesting at best. It's not going to happen. You know, Ukraine has built I don't know if people know this, but Ukraine has built a formidable war machine where they didn't have an army before whatsoever. There was no money. I mean, Ukraine has had defense ministers who held Russian passports before. I mean, this is a situation of total capture, of total neo-colonialist capture of a former territory under control. So you had 25 years of hollowing out of Ukrainian defense structures. Plus you had, I think 3 out of 7 SBU agents at one point were Russian moles or something like that. When the Maidan happened, the head of SBU counter terrorism and the head of counter espionage units, in fact all the top tier guys from the SBU head on to Tier 4 fled to Russia, and they burnt the archives, and I think thousands of SBU agents switched sides, right, in 2014. They've since rebuilt both intelligence and military capacity, and they've built a remarkable war machine. I mean, Ukraine is now a war power, and they're still reliant on volunteers and on foreign donations, and they're still reliant on the Canadian help and the Polish help. The Canadian, the Polish, and the American ambassadors are the most 3 important foreign representatives in Kiev. They're still incredibly reliant on all sorts of help, technical assistance, but no one's going to fight the war for them, right? And they've done a very good job of building up security structures. That's actually the one thing they've done extremely well. They've built a formidable army. They've built volunteer battalions. They've built tank battalions. They do need weapons. They still cannot. They don't have an air force anymore, and they didn't really have one compared to the Russians. And the Ukrainian Navy no longer exists after what happened in Sevastopol. There's talk now of rebuilding it, but they have, I think, like 3 or 4 ships, right? There is no capacity to withstand a total invasion, a blitzkrieg from the Russian side. If the Russians want to take Kiev, it would take them a couple of weeks to do it, but they would be able to do it. Could they hold on to Ukrainian territory? No. Could they, if they brought in 250,000 Russian troops with everything that the Russian army has to take over Ukraine, could they take it? Absolutely. Could they hold the territory? There would be partisan warfare. Thousands of Russian boys were coming home to Russia in coffins. There would be a lot more opposition in the Russian Federation than there is now. But they have built an army. They have built defense capacities. They've built enough deterrence capacity to make any more taking of territory very costly, unnecessary, and pointless for the Russian army and the Russian-led mixed separatist forces. Actually, we have all sorts of arguments amongst analysts and journalists and IR guys what to call the pro-separatist rebels. But is NATO on the table for Ukrainians? It should be. They need to have something to aspire to reach for. But the situation on the ground militarily, it will be, the line will be held by Ukrainian troops, as it has been, as several thousand Ukrainian troops have been killed already. A combination of sanctions and threats on the economic space to the Russian Federation is what will keep more territory from being taken. But NATO, obviously, they should have it as a option, as a space to maneuver in. But the Ukrainians are on their own for now. Thank you.
Okay, I would like to shift attention now a bit from the transatlantic relationship and from Ukraine towards the European efforts to facilitate more European defense integration. The history of European defense cooperation is so far rather sad. It has been tried many times, it has never really succeeded. This year has been very significant. Major steps have been taken. Jean-Claude Juncker, the Commission President, has declared the Security Union one of his main projects that he wants to push forward. We've seen developments like the planning of the European Defense Fund. There has been a reflection paper on the future of European security and the plans for a permanent structured cooperation between certain countries are being pushed forward. So very significant steps have been taken. And Magdalena, I would like to know, what is your assessment? Is this, for the first time, a real step forward or not? What is your opinion?
I mean, for us, it was remarkable that this debate really gained traction after Brexit. And when we saw like the French-German tandem and a lot of these initiatives that you mentioned, and moving forward with the global strategy was also seen by some as an attempt to divert attention from where integration has just collapsed to the one field where there was room for integration because nothing has been happened, and you could create a momentum with like writing papers, alluring to projects that would take years to implement in the defense industry. I'm still not sure, but I'm not the real expert of European defense cooperation, especially in like the procurement area, how much is actually possible and how much will be in the end will fail because of national interest, or in the future, how would this European defense structure then look like? Fundamental differences, where the Germans have been pushing for a more institutionalized approach. This would be a good thing to push for the European army, or to come with this new headquarter and a new medical headquarter that Ursula von der Leyen suggested. The French and others said it's more about capabilities, it's more action, it's more what we're actually going to do. And I think the French approach, or the ones also on the other side of the pond who say, okay, more Europe doesn't mean like a duplication of more bureaucratic position, but actually more effective cooperation. I think they were looking forward to these kind of initiatives. But if we see on the ground, and I mean some of the crises around Europe were already mentioned, there is not much that we see. And actually, when I just look at northern Iraq, where every European member state is training individually, nationally Peshmerga forces, why is there no European mission? Why is there no cooperation, even on the political level, not even to speak of the military level? So in my perspective, it's much more of a talk, because there is something to talk about, and nobody would quickly follow up on, has this actually happened, because so much research is involved, so many bureaucratic hurdles, so you don't have to come up with results so quickly, but it can still be a good prestige project. I lost my second point, but maybe I will come to that again.
Okay.
More of a talk, more of a prestige project. Would you agree or disagree? What maybe we ask the former Vice President of the European Parliament.
Well, you know, when we talk about the integration of European defense industry, well, this is obviously a problem which goes on, and on. I remember quite vividly the idea of having a common European tank, which ended up with France building their own tank, Germany building their own, British building their own tank. Well, the same was with the planes. The Eurofighter was supposed also to be a fighter for France, but France decided to build their own Rafale. So, it didn't work. Now it looks like with the financial incentives of European Union, things may look better, and at least there are talks about common future tank which is supposed to be built between France and Germany. So that may be a sort of a light in the tunnel. But when we talk not about the European defense industry, which obviously must face the challenge of American industry and also other industries, and we talk about real military capabilities, the main question is, what is European level of ambition? Because if you look at Lisbon Treaty, there is a famous Article 42.5, which says that in case of an attack on a European Union member country, all countries should rally in support and help the country which would be an object of this attack. What that does mean, nobody knows, because this is not a hard security guarantee, because had it been a hard security guarantee, that would turn the European Union into a military alliance, which European Union is not, and cannot be, because of the commitments made very strongly before Lisbon Treaty was adopted, commitments to Irish, who were very much afraid that Lisbon Treaty may actually be construed as military alliance, and that's why they, in first time in the referendum, voted against. So to make them voting again on this treaty, these assurances were absolutely necessary. So, European Union is not a military alliance. So what is the real meaning of this article? Nobody really knows. Nobody really knows. So far in European Union, what is actually accepted are so-called Petersburg missions. What Petersburg missions are? They're humanitarian, peacekeeping, peace monitoring, peacemaking, but this is rather subtle, and nobody really, again, is quite clear how far we can go. And, if we would limit ourselves to these Petersburg missions, then the question is why to build a huge command structure? Because so far, these Petersburg missions involved up to 2,000 soldiers. And to have a command structure which would have 500 officers plus 500 civilians to command the operation 2,000 soldiers is a bit excessive. So, these are the problems. You mentioned that Juncker said about the European army. Well, the European army can only be sort of envisaged in a situation when Europe would be a federal state. Because there must be a body this army will be an instrument. Well, as long as there is no European government, this army would sort of hang in sort of a limbo. Nobody would be in charge of this army. Nobody could treat this army as an instrument. So what we can really, actually, realistically think about is to increase the level of European units which could be used in some situations, but again, so far experience is rather discouraging, because in the European Union there are so-called battle groups. These battle groups were set up years ago, and no battle group was ever used. No one. Despite of all troubles, all problems, and all needs. Well, I don't want to go into debate what could be done, but I'm very skeptical about this sort of grand plans. Mogherini, in her paper, wrote that the European Union should be ready to play a role of defending the member states. How it is going to be done, I do not know. And especially in a situation when in the European Union we have no longer British. So in a situation when Europe will have some security interests which United States would not be feeling ready to support and to commit itself, like it was in case of Libya, then the question is how to handle the situation without the British. I think that some kind of cooperation with the British would be absolutely necessary. There is, however, sorry for being so talkative, there is, however, one instrument which obviously should be used, and there are good indications that it will be used, and this is so-called permanent structured cooperation, so-called PESCO. That means group of countries would lump together and decide to cooperate militarily on a far bigger scale than other countries, which is possible due to Lisbon Treaty. This probably is a certain way of advancing the security problems of Europe, but that clearly would create a situation in which there will be more and more sort of elements of European, of various levels of integration. Thank you.
Okay, interestingly, both of our European speakers on the panel are rather skeptical about European defense integration. I will stop asking questions at this point. I will open the floor. Your questions are welcome now. Please be brief. Please let it be a question. We will start collecting 3 questions. The gentleman in the 3rd row. Do we have a microphone somewhere? I think you have to do without. Please. There's a microphone coming. Perfect.
Thank you for the floor. My name is Ivo Kaplan. I am Secretary General of Union of European Federalists and member of the board on the European scale. I am very astonished. I think it's a great pity that Mr. Babiš and Mr. Petriu and this member of European Parliament, Labajová, didn't hear this debate, especially Mr. Chase. Because Mr. Chase is American, I think he's living a little bit in Germany, but he explained what are the federalist ideas in Europe. That is not unifying of Europe. It is giving to nations all rights to protect itself, to develop itself, and to make the best. It's not about tax equalization. It's absolutely wrong and disinformation. It's information for you. And my questions. The first one is for Magdalena. What she thinks that will be done now in the most probable government, Jamaica in Germany, with this European defense. Because I think it's a disaster. It's an information which will disrupt the big efforts of President Macron, if you agree with. And from that is my recommendation, and also a question for Mr. Chase. If there is possible to make a minority government in Germany, only of CDU, so in this European defense questions should be supported with Martin Schulz. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting questions. I'm looking forward to your responses. Do we have a third question at this moment? The gentleman in the third row was first, and you will be first in the next round of questions then.
Charles Ross, European Anti-Corruption Center. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking the time this morning to come to Prague and to share your expertise. I think it goes without saying that everyone in this room understands that after 3.5 years, the success of the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine is of strategic importance to the West. And though I've been saying this for 3.5 years, it's taken some time for a lot of people to figure this out. I'd like to follow up on the thoughts about a more integrated approach to European defense policy. In the discussion paper of the European Union that was brought here by Jean-Claude Juncker and Mrs. Mogherini in June at the Jofin, we basically see from page 12 3 steps at the modernization and more effective usage of resources in Europe. I'd like to put this into a longer perspective that, in fact, in looking at Ukraine and a very significant global defense industry, the Pentagon in Washington has already stated that they're very interested in working on equipment with the Ukrainians because this is an asset to the West, and I think General Mattis and his men and women fully understand the strategic implications long term. History renews itself every morning, everywhere. And so we need to see the long term in a strategic perspective, looking out, say, 30 years. I'd like to ask to our distinguished experts here, how do you see over the long term, given the fact that Ukraine has made a decision and has made tremendous efforts at reforms and cleaning up the mess and generally moving forward to become a full, independent, and successful member of the Western community? I think, yes, there is no going back on this, and it is the Ukrainians' own decision to fix the mess in their country, in their Ukraine. The amount of money which will be spent in the next 30 years to assist the Ukrainians in modernizing their own country will be an order of magnitude larger than that which was spent for the Marshall Plan at the end of World War II. So my question to you, ladies and gentlemen, is how do you see over the long term a more effective cooperation between the European and American defense industries within the diplomatic structure, which is effectively a required approach? Because, in fact, as General Mattis has said, the defense solution for deterrence is not sufficient. And Mr. Chase, you have underlined this emphatically throughout your career, that in fact it is a diplomatic synergy of approaches that does it. How do you see this developing over the long term, given the fact that we are en route and that it is an irreversible route? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. We might start with your question and ask it if you agree to Mr. Chase, who has worked as a diplomat on transatlantic relationship for decades. So if I may ask you to start.
There were a lot of different parts of your question. Trying to break them down to the near term, strictly military. Yes, Mattis and others have recognized that, as Vladislav was saying, Ukraine has built up of a necessity its defense capabilities, its munitions, its traditional defense armaments and industry, and there's a utility to build collaboration with them. Industry to industry, but also to support and provide. There is a decision making going on in Washington as to what and how the United States will actually begin to provide armaments and weapons to Ukraine. This related to this, however, is your other point, quoting I think Mattis again about defense is not sufficient for deterrence. The Obama administration in the second term was talking about what they called a third offset strategy. And essentially the third offset strategy was an understanding that traditional defense industries, fighters, tanks, missiles, whatever, are important, but are completely insufficient in today's world and today's security thing, that there is a need to offset the capabilities that the Russians and the Chinese have in the hard defense way with additional technological aspects, and that's the technology offsetting this. And it led to a rethinking of the relationship between our defense industry, our Department of Defense, and the private sector writ large. So there's a lot of capabilities that have become dual use in a world of artificial intelligence and big data and cybersecurity and all of these other things. So in a sense, there's a change going on in the defense paradigm in the United States where, frankly, Ukraine probably also has a lot of assets that need to be thought about. Third aspect of your question, you talked about a Marshall Plan for the Ukraine. We need to remember that the Marshall Plan was a plan that galvanized government funds for the reconstruction of Europe after the war because there was no other source of funds. Marshall Plan is a misnomer. The question is how do you generate and attract private capital into an economy that promotes its development both as an economy and, of course, its in this sense, security capabilities. That is a long-term thing, and that depends entirely on the government of Ukraine. It's up to the government of Ukraine, and for that matter, it's up to any government to create an environment where private capital, private trade, private investment is built. And, you know, I think that you work for the European Anti-Corruption Center, you said, dealing with the issue of corruption in Ukraine, or for that matter in Russia, and elsewhere, is a big part of this. It's a place where there can be a lot of technical assistance. It's an inherent part of development, of economic development, and it needs to be seen as such. But it is a question of creating a rules-based system where property is protected from the government and from abuse by the government. I don't know if you were asking about whether that means in 30 years' time Ukraine can or should be part of NATO. I actually was trying to say that, in fact, I think Ukraine can and should be. But this has to be separated from the issue of how you're trying to deal with the Russian incursion, the Russian annexation. And in the meantime, in that interim period, there are a number of countries that are very close, have very close allies and military cooperation with NATO and with the EU as such, and there's nothing that precludes that sort of very close integration and cooperation between Ukraine and its allies.
Thank you, Peter. Then we had a question about the impact of the German election. Thank you for that. You were asking what a possible Jamaica coalition would mean for transatlantic relationships. I don't know if everyone in the room is aware. The outcome of the election in Germany yesterday was that Angela Merkel basically won, but her party, the Christian Democrats, lost many seats. The Social Democrats scored the worst result in their history, so they failed to make Martin Schulz the next chancellor, and they said we will be out of the next coalition. So what seems to be a probable or only possible scenario is a Christian Democrat, Green, Liberal, what we call in Germany Jamaica coalition, something which is very difficult to achieve and which has never been there. That's the question, Magdalena. What would that mean? And if I may, I would like to give that question about the minority government also to Magdalena. Would you agree? Yeah? Okay.
There will be a minority.
If there will be, and or what the impact might be.
I mean, on the election is, I think there's one sentence sums it up. You can be shocked by something that you saw coming. And Jamaica was debated much more than the minority government. Jamaica was debated in the last weeks when it was looming that it would be either Grand Coalition. Grand Coalition would result in AFD, the right-wing party, being the head of the biggest faction in the opposition, and therefore getting more parliamentary rights. There's everyone but AFD agreed that this would be that shouldn't be achievable, and this is why yesterday SPD said we will not enter negotiations. We will see if they hold the ground when Jamaica will not be able to form a government. Sebastian said it. We had some experiments on the state level. Some worked-ish, or it just started. Some fell apart. And as the FDP, the Liberals were out of parliament in the last 4 years and didn't really make a foreign policy, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but they did not really make a foreign policy election campaign. There was one buzz, a major buzz, when Christian Lindner was kind of trying to, accept the fact that Crimea would be a frozen conflict and this would be something good, which would be a good working condition, where people got like really alerted. So the first thing that people concluded last night from the fact that this coalition building is looming is that Angela Merkel would kind of have to backpedal from her leader of the free world, I can negotiate every conflict everywhere and never sleep, but has to turn to domestic politics. Negotiations will be tough, and they're expected to still last for 2 months. So nobody is expecting that there will be a quick result. So that means that her attention will be on domestic politics. This vote was not decided on international politics, not on European defense, but on immigration. Mostly, so she has to bring her house in order. Also, the CSU party in Bavaria lost dramatically. There will be a lot of questions. So I think the attention of the German government will be inward looking for at least half a year. And then we don't know what will be the conclusions for it. Regarding, I would call it the eastern flank, the Greens were pretty clear on their support for the sanctions. And it wasn't, as I said, I don't think that AfD's opposition or, admiration in part of Vladimir Putin and the SPD's shaky position on this was necessarily, it was neither rewarded nor punished by the voter, but it gives Merkel more leeway to push harder or to maintain sanctions because she's not undermined by the Social Democrats if she states that course. Something with regarding to European defense, but more like European security policy initiatives, the Greens have been very skeptical. But I think that's more regarding the Ministry of Defense of acquisition. There is research, but it doesn't lead to anything. There's a waste of money. It's not effective. I'm not really sure if they're as critical about this on the European level as on the national level, but here I think they would be critical and ask questions that would not necessarily lead to a major a major boost in research projects. They were also critical, and this could be important for the future of Germany taking military responsibility in the world on these E2I and training initiatives, because the pragmatism to work with clearly not only not democratic, but clearly authoritarian and dictator states, just to secure border security, the lack of coordination, and the lack of communication with the public was severely criticized. As I said, FDP was not really in these discussions. I would say they would probably opt in favor of more flexibility instead of institutionalized or even like troop deployments by the German armed forces. But I think there will be a review on under which conditions will be soldiers sent abroad. They voted against AWACS, they voted against Mali, so there will be new discussions about European and German forces abroad.
Minority government, will it happen?
I hope not, because Jamaica is already stable, but it has like still a broader mandate. And then, in my opinion, it was like the people that were, like AfD benefited from a lot of frustration with the personal leadership of Angela Merkel. And if she's leading this government by herself, then she will draw more attention to herself. I would recommend her to pick a scapegoat, at least the Liberals or the Greens, to at least give the idea of a broader coalition. Also, SPD is expected to play a constructive role in the opposition. I think she would not necessarily benefit and make the government more stable by creating minority government.
Okay. Small turn to the German election. We're slowly coming to the end of the debate, but John Lloyd, there's still time for your question. There's a microphone coming.
It was really for Janusz Onyszkiewicz and to try and push him a little further on Russia. Your government, not the government you wish, but the government of your country, has been the most aggressive against Russia, one which has seen or has said that Russia is the greatest threat to Europe. Is that a general view in Poland? Do you agree with it? How far do you see Russia as a real potent threat, especially to Central Europe, but to Europe as a whole?
Well, I think that the majority of, I would say, analysts in Poland would consider Russian all-out attack on Poland rather unlikely. But what looks like a real Russian goal is to create such a situation in which Baltic states would feel so vulnerable that they would be rather sort of a weak link in NATO. That means they could really be kind of a Trojan horse in NATO, trying to resist certain measures NATO can take, not to sort of, provoke some response from Russian side. So I think that what Russians are really up to, at least for the time being, is to create a situation in which the cohesion of NATO, by this kind of a looming threats or perception of threats, is concerned, that's their goal. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We will not sit much longer in your way of lunch. So we're coming to the end of this debate. What I take away from this is a very clear definition of the transatlantic relationship, which consists of values, security, and economics. What I also take away is a rather skeptical perspective of the European defense integration process and the continued demand for a strong transatlantic partnership to provide security in Eastern Europe. And very interesting insight from Ukraine, a Ukrainian nation that came into being by the war we're witnessing, which is looking west and which holds up its aspiration to become a member of the Western community one day. And a very interesting perspective from Turkey, to which NATO is even more important because it's not a member of EU and it continues to be forgotten when we're talking about a transatlantic but not a transbosporus relationship, and some perspectives on the German election result and we are really interested to see what's going to happen and if your predictions will be right. I want to thank you for this vivid debate, for your contributions. I want to thank you for your engagement and your attention, and I wish you a great lunch.